So we're very, very pleased to have in the studio here today Lynn Boylan, who is our MEP, and we're very delighted to have you here with us.
Thanks a million for inviting me in. I'm delighted to be here.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, finally made it back from Brussels.
That's great. Our show is all about disability, as I said before. So people with disabilities get a bad press from governments in almost every country. And I was just wondering what it was like in Europe.
Well, last month we actually had the Disability Freedom Drive, where people who have disabilities travel to Brussels to basically lobby their MEPs from across the European Union on the issues of concern to them. We had Claire Rooney from Blanchardstown herself came over and we met with her, and we met with a few other people from Ireland as well, from around the country. One of the key issues of concern is obviously around housing, access to housing for people with disabilities, but also access to employment, because a lot of people with disabilities want to be able to go out and work and contribute to society, but they feel that either the workplaces aren't being made accessible or they're sort of seen as not wanting to be part of the labour market. So it was really interesting to hear those concerns. The other thing that we're working on is around the sign language in the European Parliament, and to allow for that to be used as well, again, for people who want to follow the European Union and all the work that it does, but to be able to follow it through sign language. So it's a key priority to push that. We have, I think, 24 different languages, direct translation, but we don't have sign language. So again, preventing people with hearing disabilities from being able to follow the work of the European Union.
And that's very important, because they have interest in it.
Absolutely, and if you can't follow it, I mean, it's a human right to be able to follow things in the language that you understand better. We fought very hard for Irish to be recognised as a formal language in the European Union, so that's the next. And I gave a commitment in the election. I went out to Cabra, to the deaf village there, and gave a commitment that we will pursue that and continue to do so.
Brilliant.
Yeah, there's been a lot of kind of negative talk about NGOs, from the right of the political spectrum. Has that affected how disability is approached in the organisations?
There has been that all NGOs are they're all bad. They're woke is the famous word now. I think woke just means you have a social conscience and you want the world and society to be better. So if that's the case, then I'm happy to be woke. But it is a real problem that we're seeing around the far right groups. But
and
also
they're quite strong in the European Parliament, aren't they?
They are, and
seats.
you now have, I think you'd need 4 groups to come together to have a majority. So it's very fractured, and that then affects the committee work, but it also affects the votes in the European Parliament. And you're seeing that language coming out all the time, that NGOs are basically setting the policy agenda, that they're telling politicians what they should and shouldn't do. And it's really concerning. And I think it's something we have to fight back, because look, NGOs are representing civil society. They're representing the people on the ground like yourselves. So you're just advocating for them, and we need to, really push back on that. If I had any concern, it'd be more about the lobbyists, the big corporate lobbyists. And that's where the focus should be. They are far too influential on politicians' decisions. NGOs are just doing their job and representing people who need representation.
Would there be lobbyists from pharmaceutical companies and the like?
Absolutely. Brussels has now passed Washington for the highest number of lobbyists per politician. So there's a lobbyist for everything. There's even a lobbyist for balloons, believe it or not. Everything is covered. But you're right, the pharmaceutical industry has huge sway in the European Union, and they tried to get the Environment Committee to split so that health would be a separate policy area, and we fought back against that, because again, that was the pharmaceutical industry who wanted a whole committee just looking after their interests and not looking after the broader interests around the environmental impact of pharmaceuticals, the health impacts for people, and the safety aspects. So we won that battle, but you always have to be on your guard, because they're very, very active, and they've a lot of people working for them.
There's always a new battle.
Always a new battle, yeah.
Tell me, what about consistency? You've been there for a couple of terms. in Europe?
Well, the public gave me a break of 5 years. So
that's not very nice.
It was very nice of them. I was there from 2014 to 2019, and then the focus was very much on austerity and the banking crash and all of that. I wasn't there the last 5 years, but now what we're seeing is obviously migration is a big issue, but it's more the far right, and they're trying to roll back rights that we've all, you know, have to fight very, very long and hard for, whether it's women's rights, disability rights, rights for people who are from ethnic minorities, and they're trying to push all of that back. They're trying to push back the environmental, you know, protections, all of that stuff. So yeah, I think it's going to be very different from the last time I was there, because they're far more strong and very vocal.
Okay, and what about people with a disability? Do they get the same focus as they did the last time you were there?
Unfortunately, I don't think so, because what we've seen is the disability rights, I suppose, will come under different topics. Like, as I said, there's housing, there's access to employment, there's gender equality issues, so it can fall under a number of different committees. But what the European Parliament also does is it has subcommittees which would look at specific areas, and one that was a standalone subcommittee was disability. That's now been rolled into another committee. So that's disappointing, because that means then that they don't have a subcommittee that's solely focused on the issues facing people with disabilities. A
thing that adults with children with disabilities think to themselves all the time, and we hear a hell of a lot, is what'll happen when my child and when I go. And those children are starting to grow up and get a bit older and so on, so they're going to have to go somewhere. Again, you said housing is a massive issue.
Housing is a massive issue. The carers allowance is a massive issue. You have parents as they get older, if they retired, or pensions on the means test is, people are getting offered a pittance, in some cases not getting anything off the state. And we know that people who are caring for anyone with a disability or an illness are providing a huge service to the state. They're saving the state a fortune.
Of course.
So we need reform of that. Mary Lou MacDonald has called for the means test to be abolished altogether, that it should be based on, the care you're providing. But again, housing and giving people reassurance that when they pass on, that their adult child with a disability is going to be looked after, and going to be looked after with human rights. At the core to it. So that's real reform that's needed of the system, and it is a huge concern for a lot of parents. My dad actually drives a bus for adults, young adults with disabilities, and brings them for respite during the day, and he said it always comes up from the parents, one, getting access to respite, overnight respite for the parents, but equally the concerns around what happens to their child when they're no longer either physically able to look after them or no longer here.
It's a massive problem.
Yeah.
And personal assistance, that's another issue that comes up a lot. There's a very few, I think, in the country,
Yeah, and one of the things, because I focus mostly on climate and environmental issues, as you probably know. One of the areas which we should be promoting as green jobs, so where we can create employment for people in jobs that are not actually bad for the environment, is the care sector. Personal assistance, if we were to invest in that and fund it and pay people properly to be able to do it, that's actually a green job that would be good for our carbon footprint, but also would be hugely beneficial for people with disabilities. So we should be growing out all of that care sector, but we have to respect care work. And it is work, and it deserves to be paid a decent wage.
For some of them, it's the only way that disabled can function in society.
Absolutely.
If they have a personal assistant.
Yeah, and we've seen that even with the disability drive in Brussels. It was essential that people were able to travel, but of course they needed a personal assistant to travel, which doubles the cost for a person with a disability to go out and lobby their MEPs. They have an extra barrier in terms of that. So absolutely we need to be investing in personal assistance.
The thing we saw in Ireland was in the crash, one of the first groups to be cut was personal assistance. And that just stopped the world for a person with a disability. Do you see that happening again?
And well, look, you never know, and that's why I think in terms of enshrining rights for people is really important, that you try and put in place protections that it can't be done again, because we know with the crash, as you said, personal assistance. I know also the adaptation grants for cars was another one that was slashed. You know, medical cards were slashed. So it looked like the most vulnerable people in society were the ones who bore the brunt of austerity, and then they're always the last to be reimbursed when things turn around. They have to fight hard to get things back again. So I think it's really important that we have mechanisms in place around our budgets, that we look at budgets from, you know, disability proof it, gender proof it, climate proof it, so that no matter who's in government, that there are certain protections in place, that you can't just with the flick of a switch just, you know, change someone's life overnight, which is what they did do.
And you find that other countries are as progressive now, and I'm talking about today, as Ireland are in dealing with people with disabilities?
I think that some are better, some are worse, which is, you know, for anybody listening in Ireland probably say, well, you can't get much worse than it is. But
it's actually improving.
Yeah, there are countries that are far worse around accessibility, you know, even just having like accessible bathrooms and things like that in public buildings. So the public space isn't very accessible, which means that people with disabilities can be trapped within their home. They can't get out and about. So there's a lot of improvements to be done, but then there's also where we could look at other countries and learn. I think again, housing is one of those areas where there are some countries doing it much better. They're having that sort of whole of life built into their housing planning. So they're planning not just for the young couple who are going to have kids, they're planning for the retirees who want to downsize but stay in their community, and they're planning for people with disabilities to be able to live within their community as well. And I think we could take a lot of learnings from countries, you know, like Austria and their public housing model that are doing this much better than we are.
Now, into your own field, you leave disability for a little while, and we talk about how progressive is the field you're in now compared to when you first were there?
Unfortunately, I think you're seeing a big push to push back on a lot of the climate measures. You know,
big businesses
pushing back, big farmers. You know, we need to protect farming, we need to provide food for people, but a lot of the big farmers are pushing back very heavily on, you know, climate measures. So that's disappointing. Obviously, the issue with Palestine is something that I'm the chair of the EU, the European Parliament's basically committee on Palestine, and we're really trying to push hard there that the EU take strong measures. And all we're asking for them to do is to treat Israel in the same way they treated Russia. You know, you have a country that's committing war crimes, they need to be sanctioned. So we're fighting very hard on that. But on climate, we'll have to watch over the 5 years. But certainly the mood music is that there's a lot of pushback for climate measures when we need to be doing much, much more. My focus is on making sure that the transition is what they call a just transition, so that nobody's left behind, that retrofitting is affordable for everybody, not just for those who are on high incomes, and also making sure that you know, public transport is accessible, so that people, if you want people to not use their cars, it has to be reliable and it has to be affordable in order for people to use public transport. So they're some of the things that we'll be pushing from the climate perspective. And then the other one that I'm working on immediately is on greenwashing. So people will be familiar, go in and labelling things like this is 100% renewable energy, or this is, you know, more sustainable than another product. And what you'd find is generally those ones are more expensive. So people who want to do the right thing are paying a premium because they think that the product they're buying is actually much more environmentally friendly, but there's no way of proving that labelling is correct. So I'm working on that file at the moment to make sure that what they say, if it does on the tin, that it does do what it says on the tin, and that you know, and to try and bring down the costs. People shouldn't be penalised for trying to do the right thing.
Is the far right as big a threat as everyone thinks?
They are, unfortunately, they're a very big threat.
I think they're likely to get stronger in the immediate.
I think in the next few years we're going to go through a rocky few years, but it's up to all of us to push back. And I think, expose them they have an easy message that, I mean, they throw out something that it's easy to fix. These issues aren't easily fixable. If you want to reduce migration, you need to stop conflict. So we need to stop arming countries because people are fleeing conflict, and we need to deal with climate change because a lot of people are being displaced because of climate change. So that's the real way you can fix migration. Most people want to stay where they were born and live. They don't want to be uprooted and travelling, but if they have no choice. So I think we all have to just keep our eyes open and be very, very tuned in to the far right and their easy messages, and to push back on it, because they don't offer any hope for anybody.
I presume all the buildings in the EU are all accessible?
The European Parliament buildings are accessible. And they've improved, but Brussels itself is still not the most accessible city, I would say. I think Dublin is slightly better when it comes to accessibility. There's a lot of cobblestones, and one of the problems they have in Brussels, which thankfully we didn't do in Ireland, is the scooters, the e-scooters that are just abandoned around the footpaths, which makes it really hard for anybody with, who's visually impaired in a wheelchair or pushing a buggy to move around the footpaths. So I'm glad we didn't go down that road.
And you'd be also glad that I don't have anything else to ask you.
Brilliant. I'm
Lynn Boylan,
done.
thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.